Thank you very much for the invitation to come here. I'm very, very happy to be able to talk here today. And I was a little bit nervous when I was asked to talk about evolutionary ecology, because that's not actually what I think I'm doing. But then I realized that actually we have stumbled upon some questions of relevance to that. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I like fire. And what better to start this day with than a picture of a fire in the sunset? Fires are simple things. They require fuel, they require some oxygen, they require biomass in a suitable state to burn. It needs to be not underwater, for example. And they require the weather conditions necessary for the fire to grow. For example, it shouldn't rain too much. And then they require, of course, that something sets things on fire. What I'm going to do today is that I'm going to have this talk in 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what fire is from an ecological perspective. Then I'm going to talk about the fire history of Norway and why I think Norway is the biggest and greatest fire experiment on Earth. And then I'm going to talk a little about the research that we have done, both ecologically and evolutionary, in this system. So, yeah. First of all, with fire, as I said, it needs oxygen. And on the very, very big scale, of course, oxygen is something that plants have provided and photosynthesis has provided on Earth. So before plants, before biomass, there was no fire. That's something for us to think about. And if you look at the amount of oxygen that has been in the atmosphere over the history of the Earth, that has varied a lot. And what's interesting is that there are some limits here. So this graph shows the probability that something will burn as a function of the oxygen concentration. So you need to have more than around 19% oxygen in the atmosphere for fire to happen. And if you're above like 25-30%, it's very, very, very easy for things to burn. Today, the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, but it hasn't always been like this. In some periods of the history of the Earth, there's been a lot. Let's see if I can. Yeah. There's been a lot more. Like 300 million years ago, for example, there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. 100 million years ago, again, there was also a lot. And then there's been periods with lot or much and little oxygen. This means that fire has varied a lot through the history of the Earth. And this is a super complicated graph. I just wanted to show you that if you look at the very, very long-term perspective, so from 400 million years until today, there has been a great variation in how much fire there has been on Earth. In the beginning, there just wasn't enough oxygen. And so therefore, the fire probability was really low. And then we had quite a long period where there was higher oxygen concentration than today. And in those periods, there's been a lot of fires. And recently, fire is controlled by other things, more by climate and such. So now there's actually less fire than there used to be. So my point here is that a lot of the lineages on Earth, of plants and animals and whatnot, have evolved in a world that is much more fire-prone than the one we live in today. Now, therefore, we also see in many plants and animals and whatnot, we see adaptations to fire. So species have adaptations to fire. This is just one example. Thick bark in pines is a fire adaptation. And this has evolved. First of all, it's evolved, been gained and lost repeatedly through the history, especially of one subgenus of the Pinaceae. But it's something that has sort of come and gone. So species adapt to fire, and there's a lot of other adaptations, of course. Fire is also important for vegetation structure. Many of you have seen figures like this before, where you have, this is an alternative stable state type figure, where you have something, for example, resource availability on the x-axis, and then you have 2 different stable states of vegetation: the savanna and the forest. And the fire activity is one of the factors that can regulate. So if you have if you are here, there is always savanna. If you have here, there is always forest. But there's a big area here in the middle where you can have both. And fire activity is one of those things that can regulate if you are at this stage or at this stage. So fire can also regulate ecosystem structure. Now we humans and our relatives we are the only species on Earth that really sort of on a large scale have impacted fire regimes on Earth. And again, we can look at this as very, very long time scales, starting from 1 million years ago or so. Humans and human species started to use fires that already existed for their purposes. What this figure shows is sort of the size of these blobs are supposed to be the amount, sort of how strong the influence is. So we started to use fires that were natural came by lightning, and then gradually we started to learn how to control fire and how to use it, not only to increase the frequency of it, but also to have fires in seasons where it didn't naturally occur. And then when we started with agriculture, then the connectivity of the landscapes and the possibility of fires to travel to a landscape was also affected by us. So we control fires to a quite large degree. And what have we used fire for? This is a fantastic book, by the way. You have to read this. So humans often think about deforestation as the thing we use fire for, or humans have traditionally used fire for. So burn away the vegetation and the landscape. But we have also used fire for a lot of other things. We don't usually think about this one, but when you start cooking your food, then you can invest a lot less energy in your intestines, and then of course there is more left for the brain. But we have also used fire for a lot of different things related to landscape. Deforestation, yes, but we can also use it to chase animals around if you want to hunt them, for example. Create and maintain alternative habitats. This is really important. We use it to make some habitats that we humans can use for something, for example, to attract grazers. This one is really important, tidying up the landscapes. Why do we want to do that? Well, if you don't want to be hunted by things, then having an open, clear landscape is actually quite useful if you have enemies. But there's a lot of different ways that we have. Slash and burn farming is about this. Of course, recently we started using fire for running engines. What this book says is that the landscapes that the colonial people, the Europeans came to in Australia, they were hunter-gatherers, right? They weren't farmers. But they had these landscapes that was completely manipulated and changed by the way that people used fire in it. So also sort of the global big picture. Now we're talking about the last 2,000 years or something. Down here we have the area that we are using for human purposes. And this has increased quite dramatically, of course, in the last couple of 100 years. But things have also happened to the fire regimes on Earth on these kinds of time scales. So there has been a long-term global cooling, and as a function of that, the fire regimes have sort of gradually, there has been less, this is the amount of fire, there's been less fires until about the Little Ice Age. Then we started to use fire to open up landscapes and to clear forest on a global scale. But another interesting bit is that in the last sort of decades or 100 years or so, what has really happened is that we have been doing fire suppression all over the world. Everywhere also where fire is a natural part of the ecosystems, we are really keen to suppress fires. And that's something that actually creates problems. For example, in North America and in Australia, when they have these huge big bushfires, it's because they suppress natural fires, then you get a buildup of a lot of fuel on the landscapes, and then when lightning strikes, you have a problem. So, yeah, so we have a complicated relation with fire. So why am I telling you this very big global story now? Well, because there is also a biogeography to fire, and there we have a very interesting role to play. So fire is not evenly distributed on Earth, and this picture is just from 2000 and something, all the fires that were lit on the landscapes of Earth in I don't remember the year, but 2006, 2007, I think. These are both the natural fires and the human fires. So you can, for example, see that in the Amazon, there is a little bit more fire than we like to think about. But the interesting thing that I wanted to point out to you today was that there are areas on Earth that are almost fire-free. The oceans, they don't burn. Antarctica doesn't burn. Deserts don't burn, there is no fuel. There's different reasons. There is different reasons why these areas don't burn. You also have some areas like densely populated areas. They don't burn very often because there is not so much fire on the landscapes and because we have fire engines and people to go out and put out the fires. But then what I wanted to point out to you was that also some like the very northern areas, but especially the northern oceanic areas, there we have very, very little fire. And if we zoom in on Norway, so this is sort of the one thing I want you to remember from after today, that Norway is actually, in fire terms, Norway is an extremely cool country, the coolest country on Earth, I think, because we are actually a huge fire experiment. We have, so this is supposed to be sort of just an east-west gradient in Norway. Or across Scandinavia, where the humidity in the environment is very high. On the western coast, in Bergen, for example, it's about twice as high as I appreciate. And then, okay, 3 times. And then it decreases gradually eastwards. This means that the natural fire frequency is also very high in the west, just because the landscapes are always some state of soggy. Mikael Olsson and his colleagues have done some great work looking at fire frequencies in forests in Norway, and what they find, I don't know if you can see these numbers, but sort of the fire return time in Norwegian forests are sort of hundreds of years, up to some forests that he called fire-free, which I think is very, It means that they haven't burned since the last ice age anyway. So, very rare fires. But then you have this odd situation out on the coast where, and all these purple arrows mark localities that have been investigated by paleoecologists, and they found them to look roughly like this, which means that you have trees on the landscape, but the trees, so this is old, and then I'll show you this more in detail later, but the point is that they have charcoal record that can tell us that it's been burning all the time for thousands of years. And so this just doesn't fit from an environmental point of view. And of course, there's people who have been lighting fires on these landscapes for thousands of years. So here we have this very nice setting where we have a fire frequency gradient and very, very low incident of fire, which is special and nice and interesting in a global perspective because it's special. And then at the same time on the coast, we have this experiment where we have this very high fire regime. So it's a huge, and not only that, but it's been sort of replicated up this very long climate gradient. It's a fantastic experiment, right? Somebody made this for us. It's amazing. And of course, there has been a lot of studies, these other names that are not Olsen down here, people who have been studying and sort of summarizing the fire history on the coast. But the main story is that it's been burning all the time on the coast. So a little close up on this paleo or pollen diagram, showing time, so 5,000 years down here, and typically how it looks. You have a lot of trees in the beginning, then they start to disappear at the same time as, for example, Kaluna and things like that come in, and the whole thing coincides with an increase in fire activity. Another neat thing about this experiment is that you have a lot of local variability. So that, for example, this is just in Hordaland, a few miles or a few tens of kilometers between different islands, and they have very different age of the fire regime. So some places it goes back 5,000 years, some places it's much shorter than that. So it's also sort of nice from an experimental point of view that we have these different histories. Of course, it's all down due to humans, and it's not only a Norwegian phenomenon. We also have these sort of fire or burning-related heathlands all over Europe from north to south. Of course, down here, it's harder to separate out the human signal because here there's also more natural fires. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I'm just going to say that the whole is, of course, all this burning. It was not only for pyromanic reasons. People also are doing this because they not only because they like it, but also because they want it or need it for something. And what they want is, of course, to make grasslands and grazing opportunities for their animals. And so they have this system where they would burn every sort of 10-ish years, 10 to 20 years, they would burn so that they will have a nice pioneer phase with a lot of grasses and good grazing opportunities. And then the heather would grow, and they could be grazed during the winter because they are evergreen. And so you have this sort of system where you burn and burn and burn to keep the landscape open and to keep good grazing opportunities. Yeah. I also wanted to just point out to you that since this is a human thing, it's also a cultural heritage. And it's actually quite old. We see the traces back in Norway going back 6,000 years. And this is older than, for example, things like this. So it's also a nice cultural heritage. Yeah. But going over to the ecology of things. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about sort of the kind of research that we have done in this system. And this is the first, of course, when you look at the system like this, you want to see, okay, so are these fires, what do they do to the ecology of the system? And so that's the first thing that we started working on at Lygra, just outside Bergen. We started doing all these sort of experiments with fire and to look at, okay, what does fire do to the biomass, to the species composition, to the biodiversity on these landscapes. And we were mostly, in the beginning, we were mostly interested in just sort of, okay, we have different environmental settings out here, like we have dry heathlands, intermediate and moist heathlands, so we can graze them and we cannot graze them. And what does that do to the fire responses in these systems? All of these things are just showing that when this is before fire, and this is the cover of Kaluna on this y-axis, and it just shows that when you burn something, the vegetation disappears, which is not sort of rocket science, and it also comes back afterwards, which is also not rocket science, but it's just sort of a nice background to have. But what was interesting with this study that we found, and that we have been working more with later, was that we found that it actually matters quite a lot for the successions, for these post-fire successions, whether you graze them or not. So here is just difference in species composition on the y-axis, and we look at what happens to the species composition years after fire. And when you burn it, you have a completely different species composition afterwards, and then it gradually goes back to where you were before. So this is the control, and this is the difference. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's interesting because it means that you have some species up here that come in after fire, and so somehow they're responding to this fire and they're there only after fire. So that's interesting. And it's also, these different dots are just different dry, intermediate, and moist parts of the landscape. So things are a little bit different in different parts of the landscape. It was also interesting that when we did the same thing, so this is an ungrazed part of the heathland, we put up fences. When we did the same thing in a grazed part of the heathland, things look a lot less tidy. We don't have these very nice successions. And of course, less tidy in an ecological, for an ecologist, means it's a good thing. It means there's probably more diversity. So that's also, and there is. So that's also an interesting observation to study the ecology of the system under different settings. But I talked about this, the great experiment and how it was set up along a climatic gradient by our ancestors. And of course, we needed to make use of that. So one thing that we have done, and this is the PhD work of Liv Guri, who is here today, so that's nice. But one thing we did was that we did, or as soon as I sort of had somebody else who could do the fieldwork, of course, then you can start to travel and do fieldwork in many places. When it's me doing the fieldwork, then it's much better to do it just in one place, because that's more convenient. Isn't that right, Liv Guri? And so then we said, okay, let's play with this. Let's play with this gradient. So we did the same kind of experiments, but we spread them out along an altitudinal gradient. No, latitudinal gradient. I've been talking about altitudinal gradients earlier this week, so I'm sort of, yeah. So we spread it out along a latitudinal gradient, and then we were interested in, so when you start a fire in these different climates, is the response the same? Is it doing the same? And to make a long history very short, we found out that no, it wasn't. So we have, we have color-coded from, the white color is because it's the light nights in the north, so it's very easy to remember. But we have color-coded these different sites by latitude. And then what we see, this is just number of species, but we have a lot of other response variables as well. And what we see is that the response that you get and the species and the number of species that you have and how fast and how slow it responds to the fire is actually quite strongly depending on where you are. There is also differences in the species composition and in the biomass buildup and a lot of things. So a fire is not a fire. It also depends on the climate that you light it in. But then we started thinking, so then there is this interesting, fires are natural, and these fires that we are lighting here are also sort of part of the ecosystem that we have on the coast. But at the same time, land use and human land use and especially human-lit fires and so on are also one of the things that we are really, really concerned about in the world as an environmental problem. So we have this interesting paradox where on one hand we have these semi-natural habitats that are dependent on fire and that are made by and created by fire, and you have the same thing in naturally burnt areas, but our system is man-made, so it makes the paradox even more sort of pressing. At the same time, you have the situation that land use and use of fire threatens biodiversity and habitats worldwide. And when we talk about this, what we often talk about is this biotic homogenization. So the story goes, or the idea is that not naturally plants and animals and species are adapted to all kinds of different systems and different habitats and so on and so forth. And this is a very important reason for the high biodiversity that we have on Earth. When we have human impacts on the ecosystems, what it does is that on average, it homogenizes the landscapes, and so therefore everything becomes more and more similar all over. So you might have high diversity in semi-natural landscapes, but you have high diversity of boring stuff. You have high diversity of things that are found everywhere. So we realized that this is something we can actually test with our system, because we have these time series of pre-burn, and then we burn, and then so we have these time series of what happens after the fire, and then we have this in all these different settings, and we can actually start to ask what kind of species is it that make it in here? Are they widespread, global, generalists, so species that we are not particularly interested in, or are they actually more valuable species, if you want? Yeah, that sounded very wrong, didn't it? All species are equal, right? Some are just, anyway, so, yeah, we can blame this on my jet lag. Anyway, so we figured, okay, we can actually test this with our study system. So what we did was that we went back to the same successions that I described to you before, and then we investigated the species that come in after the fire in all these different sites. And we asked the species that decrease after fire versus the species that increase after fire. So these are sort of the pre-fire species and the post-fire species. And then we asked what characterizes these different kinds of species. And this is just a couple of things. But for example, are they widespread, or are they do they have a relatively narrow distribution? And so this is just how many vegetation zones they are reported from in Norway. Between 2, which would be a very narrow range species, and 7, which would be a species you could find all over Norway. And what we found was that the species that are present before the fire, they are extremely widespread species. They are species that you can find everywhere. But the species that increase after fire, they have narrower geographical ranges in Norway. And we also found that the species that decrease after fire have low Ellenberg pH values, so they are not so demanding to their environment, whereas the species that increase after fire have more environmental requirements, so they are more demanding when it comes to pH, and several other things. So what it means is that the species that we see coming in after the fires in our system are not these boring global generalists, but they are actually a local species, part of the system, sort of part of the interesting biodiversity. Now I said it again. Yeah, so that's interesting. But that also talks about sort of the age of this system. If we had new disturbance coming into the system, we wouldn't see things like this. But because it's been going on for thousands of years, it means that the species have adapted, and the local biota have adapted to the system, and they know how to use and how to utilize these fires, or this environmental driver, if you want. And then zooming in a bit more on the actual players in the system. So this is one of my favorite plants, Calluna. Oops. Oh, we went way back. And one of the things that we have been investigating with Calluna is how this species responds to fires and to this sort of decades of succession in heathlands. What's interesting with Calluna is that it has seed banks, so loads of seeds in the ground. And what we have done with this is we tried to find out, okay, so how important are these seed banks in the ecology of Calluna in the heathlands? And so we were fortunate to have the Heathland Center at Lygra, where we have very good records of the fire, sort of the short-term fire history. So each of these colors are a different year. So you see that in this blue year, somebody was very, very eager, putting everything on fire. But in these different years, there's been different area that's been burned. And it's done in this way because this was the traditional land use system. They wanted to have fires. They wanted to have areas in different, where the Calluna was in different age, so that it would be good for different kinds of species. And we end up with this very heterogeneous network of patches. And what Inger Moren, during her PhD, what she did was that she collected both vegetation data and seed bank data from throughout this system. Yeah, so she had vegetation and seed bank data, and then she was able to start to look at the behavior of Calluna in the system in response to fire. On this first plot here, what we see is the cover of Calluna, and it's not exactly rocket science. When you burn the Calluna, the cover is very low, and then because it's burnt, and then it builds up gradually over. Because we had this history, we could have sort of between 1 and 20 years. She did not have a 20-year PhD, but we could have areas with different age. What was interesting here, and then we also looked at the density of seeds in the soil, and you see that there's a lot of them, sort of 5 to 10 to up to 30,000 seeds per square meter, which seems a bit excessive, but you know, this is what they do. And when Inger came to me with these graphs, when she had these graphs first, and when she came to me with these graphs, I said, okay, you must have done something wrong, because this is fine. You know, you have a buildup of vegetation and you have a buildup of a seed bank. This is fine, but this isn't very plausible. There's no plants here who could have produced all these seeds. And she went back and checked her data, and sure enough, this was correct. So, sort of, what's going on here? And this made us curious. And when you're curious as a scientist, you read. And so we went out and read about fire and seed germination and so on and so forth. And of course, smoke-stimulated germination is a huge thing in all these naturally fire-prone ecosystems. We hadn't read much about this because natural sort of fire regimes is not something that sort of is very important in when you work as a vegetation ecologist in Norway. But we started to read about this, and it turned out that so it could be. So what we were thinking, okay, if Calluna has fire-stimulated germination, maybe there are just as many seeds everywhere, but down here they're just not germinating. Here, we have burnt it. Therefore, there has been smoke, there has been ash, there has been all these fire triggers in the soil, and so these seeds actually they have got the message that okay, it has burned. and then therefore they germinate. And I should perhaps point out now that, of course, we were not out in the field counting these seedlings. We took the seed bank samples in, and then we spread them out very thinly, and we gave them everything they might ever desire to germinate in terms of water and soil and everything. So it's not the vegetation or anything that prohibited them. So this was interesting, and we read up on this from the literature, as I said. And it wasn't so very long ago that people were actually establishing the physiological mechanisms behind these fire responses. And it's actually quite simple. Across a lot of families and a lot of different groups, there are a few things, like for example, this carotenoid, this molecule here, there are a few things that many species respond to. So this was, of course, interesting, and then we also started thinking. That was when we started thinking more about, okay, people are finding this in naturally fire-prone systems, but our system is not naturally fire-prone. It's something that's made by human, but it's been there for a while, and it's something that's been going on for a good amount of time. So could it actually be that we see these adaptations also in a system like this? And if this was the case, then we have a lot of sort of simple predictions and things that we can test. The first thing we can test is simply, are Calluna seeds responding to these triggers or cues? And so we took some seeds into the lab. We germinated them, and of course Calluna seeds germinate very readily. This is just number of seeds from a number of different mother plants germinating over up to 60 days. When we gave them when we smoked the seeds, when we gave them smoke water, I don't think you need a statistical test or anything to see that they were quite a lot faster germinating. So they actually know what smoke is, the Calluna. This is interesting. And then we made, so we know that sort of the plant responds to this trigger, but what we don't know is if it's ecologically important. So we went out into the heathlands again, and we said, well, okay, so we know that Calluna responds to smoke, but we can actually make some predictions about what would happen in different areas or in different parts of the fire cycle. Because in the mature, so these guys, old heather in the mature phase that haven't been burnt for 15 to 20 years, all the seeds that have fallen from these plants every year into the soil, so the soil seed banks here, they have not been exposed to these fire triggers. But if you go in just after the fire, so just after it's burned, and collect the seed banks from the soil there, then all the seeds in the seed bank have recently been exposed to these kinds of triggers. Is it making sense? Yeah. So there's a difference there. So you could expect these guys have not been exposed to smoke in their natural environment. These guys have. And so then we can make a prediction that we expect that smoke should induce germination in these old seed banks, but we don't expect that if we add smoke that it should make any difference here, because they have already got it. They have already, everybody has it, so there should be no difference. So this was another experiment that we could test. So we went out and collected, and again we had this nice map. So we went out and collected old and sort of naive and already fire-exposed seed banks. And then, surely enough, in the newly burnt heath, we had the controls, and and they produced about 10,000 seeds per square meter, as we tend to find in this system. And whatever we did, we gave them smoke, we gave them ash, we gave them everything. Whatever we did, there was no effect. But in the old heath, we saw that we had quite a large effect of these smoke treatments. So it means that these guys, the controls here, had already been exposed to smoke. They were already germinating. These guys were not. So it has smoke-induced germination in nature, and that also, or in the seeds themselves, and that also affects how the seed banks behave in this system. Nice. Now, the really interesting question, and here I needed to bring this picture because this is Paul, who's also here, and we were so extreme. This is a small detour. I have time for that. So we were so extremely proud of ourselves because the paper that I'm going to show you some results from now, No, actually a different paper. This picture was on the front page of the journal, but Paul didn't know this. So, so we sent him a copy of the journal after it was published. We were very proud, and luckily he took it as a man. So he's the front page boy. And so, but the interesting question is, are these smoke responses that we do find in the coastal heathlands like Kaluna, are they natural? Are they something that Kaluna has from nature, or is it something that's human induced? And so there's a lot of different reasons why we think that Kaluna has quite sort of high evolutionary potential. It has high seed production in the coastal heathlands. It has short generation times, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things here that means that there's a lot of individuals for selection to act upon. And so also when it comes to Kaluna, we find it in the burnt coastal heathlands, but very conveniently, Kaluna has a much wider distribution than this. So it means that we find Kaluna in burnt situations, but we also find it in natural situations. So then we made a prediction, going back to our map of the big experiment. We made a prediction that, okay, if Kaluna is if it's natural, then we should find these responses from all over Norway. We should find fire responses from all over, no matter where we go and test it. But if this is something that's related to this human fire regime, then populations along the coast should have these smoke responses. But as we move inland, this is very small, but as we move inland from the coast and into the mountains, we should lose these fire responses in the seeds. Are you with me? Not? Yeah. And so what we did, again, we collected seeds and germinating them. Here is the gradient from south, the climate gradient. And remember, now we have two climate gradients, one going from south to north and one going from coast inland. And though they are not the same, at least in temperature, we can say that they're roughly parallel. And so what we found was when we go from south to north, we have significant fire responses all along the gradient. There is no change. But what we thought was quite neat was that when you go from the coast, so this is Lygra, nice fire response, when you go into the inland, the response actually disappears. So it's the coastal populations that have this. Interesting. Next question, and this is the last thing that I'm going to show you. Next question is, of course, is it just Kaluna? Is it just this one species, or is it more? And so last year, one of my master students, Sigrid Bruvoll, she went out and she looked at seed germination of many species in 3 coastal populations in Western Norway, and then also 3 alpine populations that sort of matched these coastal populations. And she found stuff like this. So this is another header. Here you have the germination in the solid line is without smoke. The dotted line is with smoke, so there is a smoke response. This one only grows on the coast, of course, so we only had one area. Here is Potentilla erecta. Coastal population in red, it germinates faster with smoke than without. The alpine population, no difference. But we also have species like this, Anthoxanthum moderatum, no smoke response on the coast, no smoke response in the mountains. So there's all kinds of different things. But she tested 18 species, and 14 out of them had significant smoke responses, which was much more than I had expected. And it was also interesting that of those 14 species, 11 of them had this difference between coast and inland. So stronger responses on the coast. And that was also quite surprising, especially because these populations are not that long inland. So yeah, nice. So yeah, so smoke responses are stronger on the coast. So to a couple of slides to wrap up. So we've shown that both the ecology and also sort of evolutionary processes in Kaluna heathlands are affected by fire and by smoke, but who cares? And actually this research was extremely important for convincing Rune Halvorsen that coastal heathlands are something different from boreal heaths. So they were allowed to have a different category in the NIN system. And everybody who's been working with Rune know that if you can convince him of something based on research, then you should be happy with your science. We've also worked on Sitka spruce impacts in this system. I haven't talked about that because I didn't have time, but that was very important. That was used in the blacklisting work for Sitka spruce. All this, the farmers along the coast are actually really interested in this stuff. They think it's cool and they think it's neat because it's about heritage, and they like this, and we use it a lot both in courses and also in the different kinds of outreach. And I should say, all of this, or most of what I've shown you, are actually data and things that students have collected as part of little research projects. So it's a two-sided thing. I think it's nice for the students. I hope it's nice for the students to be part of research projects, but it's certainly very nice for me to have access to all this great free labor. And then there will be a talk later about a project that we just started, working called Lampress, looking at fire and ecosystem services. And we also have a new project coming in this year where we look at, it's called hidden costs, but we had no questions to the budget from the Research Council. But it's about carbon and forestry on the coast. And of course we want to use this experiment more in both basic and applied research. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and for our funders and students and so on and so forth. Thank you.
And again, a token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And those of you that want to stay for the annual meeting, stay here. The others can just leave out to have waffles and